Hello and welcome back. Today I'm bringing you another dark enemies to lovers romance about a woman who runs from a dangerous man, almost escapes, and falls into his arms instead. Literally. Sophia Reyes is 24, a florist with a gallery show and a life she built entirely on her own. Dante Caruso is 36, and what he's built is considerably less wholesome. When Sophia's brother steals $8 million from him and vanishes, leaving her holding the only key that matters, she has one plan: disappear before Dante finds her. She almost makes it. Now she's behind his walls, fighting him at every turn, and something far more dangerous than him has just learned her name. If you love slow-burn tension, morally gray heroes, and heroines who refuse to be managed, this one is for you. A quick note: this story contains themes of captivity and coercion in a dark romance context. If that's not for you, no worries. But if it is, settle in. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like this. It genuinely helps more than you know. And drop a comment telling me what enemies to lovers trope is your favorite. I read every single one. Now, let's begin. Episode 1, The Gallery. Sophia Reyes had been watching the door for 40 minutes. She had certainty that Dante Caruso would find her tonight. The evening her life ended and began. She was standing beneath an arch of her own making, wearing borrowed shoes, accepting a champagne flute from a waiter she didn't recognize. One who moved through the room with the specific efficiency of someone who was not there for the art. She drank the champagne. She smiled. She accepted compliments on the 1,200 white ranunculus suspended overhead, 3 years of florist's early mornings wired by hand, and she kept one eye on every exit in the room. She had planned to be gone by now. The plan had involved a car, a packed bag 3 blocks from her apartment, and a contact in Montreal who owed her brother a favor. It had not involved a sold-out gallery opening or a press photographer, or a review online at 11 this morning that made leaving impossible to explain. So she stayed, and she waited, and she watched the door. He was not looking at the art. The man in the charcoal suit stood in front of the willow installation for 11 minutes and looked at nothing except her. Sophia held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to convey she'd noticed and was unimpressed, then turned back to her glass.
10 minutes.
Her friend Chloe murmured at her elbow.
At you, not at the art.
Sophia said nothing. She felt the gaze on her neck like a hand that hadn't touched her yet.
What's happening?
Chloe asked. Nothing, Sophia said. 20 minutes later, she excused herself. She moved toward the service corridor with the unhurried purpose of someone checking on an installation. Past the hanging eucalyptus, past the utility door she'd unlocked at 4 that afternoon and verified again at 7. Into the corridor, down the back stairs, into the cold night air of the alley. She moved fast, not running, because running on cobblestones in borrowed heels was a commitment she wasn't willing to make until absolutely necessary. But walking with the velocity of a woman with a very specific destination and an extremely finite amount of time to reach it. Left at the alley mouth, past the flower stalls shut for the night, right on Canal, 3 blocks, 2.5. She could feel the city opening around her, the particular freedom of moving without permission, and she let herself think the word, almost. He was leaning against the black car at the corner of Canal and Green, hands in the pockets of his charcoal suit, watching her approach with an expression that was entirely without surprise. Sophia stopped. He had not followed her out of the gallery. He had been here first, which meant he had known her exit route, which meant he had been inside long enough, or known enough people inside, to establish exactly what she would do before she did it. He looked, in the thin yellow light of the street, like a man who had been patient for a very long time and had simply decided that tonight was when patience ended. Tall, dark hair, a face built entirely from angles, jaw, cheekbone, intention, and eyes the color of winter sky, fixed entirely on her.
Miss Reyes?
Low voice, Italian cadence beneath measured English.
Your brother Matteo worked for my organization for 4 years before he left, taking $8,200,000 of mine. We need to speak. Privately.
She looked at the car, back at him. I don't believe I caught your name, she said pleasantly.
Dante Caruso.
She had known his name for 13 months. Hearing it from his own mouth was different. It landed in her chest and stayed there, small and cold. Mr. Caruso. Her voice stayed steady. I haven't spoken to my brother in over a year.
The car, Miss Reyes.
He gestured toward it and waited.
You can walk to it willingly, or choose the alternative.
She looked at the intersection. 40 feet, maybe 45. The heels were borrowed. She had nothing against abandoning them.
I wouldn't,
he said quietly. She looked back at him.
Run.
His eyes were steady and without cruelty, which was somehow worse than cruelty.
Because of the champagne.
The word arrived a half-second before the sensation did. A peculiar loosening at the edges of her vision, a warmth behind her sternum she'd attributed, until this moment, to anxiety and cold air. It was not those things. You laced it? She said without inflection.
A precaution. I needed you to run slowly enough to find.
She drew a breath, squared herself, looked at him with everything she had left. So, she tilted her head. You found me. What are you offering?
Offering?
You said willingly. That word implies a choice, which implies something on the other side of the word or. She kept her voice dry. Let's hear it. He looked at her for a long moment.
Or,
he said,
you fall down on a public street, and I pick you up and put you in the car anyway. We arrive at the same place, without the pretense of agreement.
That's not much of an alternative. She made her decision in the half-second she had left. One clean step backward, weight on the balls of her feet, an angle toward the alley. The world tilted. Not dramatically, the way a ship tilts in a swell, slow, complete, irresistible. The cobblestones came up, or she went down. She felt his hands before she understood they were there, one at her waist, one at her shoulder, catching her weight with the practiced efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this moment. She was in his arms. This was, objectively, the worst possible outcome of the evening. The city dissolved at the edges. She could feel her own pulse in her temples, and the warmth of him against the cold night, and the smell of expensive fabric and something underneath. Cedar, perhaps, or something darker, and she thought, with the last fully functional part of her mind, that she should say something. She had always been very good at saying something. She tipped her head back and found his face. His gray eyes were watching her with an expression that was not triumph, not satisfaction, something more careful, something she couldn't name before the edges came for her. For the record, she said with great precision, I almost made it. A pause. Something shifted in those gray eyes, brief and unguarded, quickly recovered.
Almost.
He agreed quietly. She had almost made it. That was the part he kept returning to. Not the route she'd mapped, not the composure she'd held under a threat she'd had no time to prepare for. Not even the way she'd looked at him with something that was not fear, something harder and colder and considerably more interesting. She had still almost made it. He had been in rooms with frightened people his entire life. They all looked the same when they understood who he was. They made themselves smaller. She had looked at him, understood precisely who he was, and made herself larger. This was going to be inconvenient. He put her in the car with more care than the situation strictly required and did not examine why. Episode 2. The Estate. She came back to herself in stages, aware of pressure first, then temperature, then the quality of the silence around her. The car was still moving. This struck her as extraordinarily funny for a reason she couldn't immediately locate. She opened her eyes. The leather seat beneath her was the most expensive thing she had ever been unconscious on, which seemed like a waste. She turned her head. Dante Caruso was sitting at the opposite end, looking out the window, apparently unaware that she had rejoined the living. "You have a very serious face," she informed him. "Has anyone told you that? It's very—" She made a vague gesture that she intended to be precise. "Architectural." He turned. Something moved behind his eyes.
How do you feel?
"Trapped," she said, which was not the answer she'd meant to give. She meant the champagne. The way it was sitting behind her eyes, soft and too warm, making the edges of everything slightly ungoverned. The way she could feel his presence on his side of the car, the way you feel a fire from across a room, not touching, not even close, but impossible to be unaware of. That was what she meant. He went very still. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. That is actually very unsettling," she said quietly, as if to herself. He turned, just slightly, just enough, and looked at her with an expression that was not quite neutral, and waited. She tilted her head and looked at him the way she normally only allowed herself to look at things when no one was watching. Openly. Without the guard she'd spent years building into a reflex. "You're very attractive. It's just factually a problem, because you're also the most dangerous man I've ever been in a car with, and I've been in cars with some genuinely unpleasant people." Dante said nothing. His expression had gone very still in the specific way of a man who has decided that any response he makes will be the wrong one. "Most men are one or the other," she continued with the solemn precision of someone delivering a thesis. "Attractive or dangerous. You've managed both, which is—" She paused. "Inefficient of you."
You should rest.
"I've been resting for 40 minutes without my permission." She turned to face him more fully, and the car tilted again, and she reached out to steady herself against the nearest solid thing, which turned out to be his shoulder. Her fingers had barely grazed the line of it, sharp, warm, exactly as architectural as she'd said, when his hand closed around her wrist. Not roughly, just closed. Complete and immediate and utterly certain, the way he apparently did everything. She became very aware of the size of his hand and the fact that her pulse was doing something it had no business doing, given the circumstances. She looked down at his hand around her wrist, then up at his face. Up close, the gray of his eyes was more complicated than she'd had time to register on the street. Not flat, not cold, but layered, like weather. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't name, something in the narrow space between careful and something else entirely, and he had not let go of her wrist. "That," she said with great dignity, "was for balance."
I know.
He said, which was the most unsettling possible response, because it meant he was not going to mention it again, and not mentioning it was somehow more dangerous than mentioning it. He released her wrist slowly. She moved her hand back to her own lap with the deliberate care of someone restoring an object to its correct position. "I want it noted," she said after a moment, "that I will remember none of this favorably."
I expect not.
She did not speak again for the rest of the drive. Neither did he. But she was aware, with the part of her the champagne hadn't reached, that he was looking at her reflection in the dark glass of his window. Not the way a man looks at a problem, the way a man looks at something he is trying with considerable effort not to find interesting. She filed this information away and said nothing about it. The estate was everything her anger needed it to be, large, impressive, and deeply irritating in its beauty. Iron gates, stone walls with the permanent quality of something that had decided to exist and intended to keep deciding. Every window lit from within, as if the building itself was at work. She catalogued exits on the drive-in. 2 guards on the outer drive, 1 at the gate, a motion sensor on the upper lip of the east wall. She revised her timeline. Not tonight. The man waiting at the entrance was 6'5", built like a geological feature, with a brow scar and a face that had been party to several confrontations. When he saw Dante, his entire expression shifted toward genuine warmth, disorienting to reconcile with the rest of him. When he saw Sophia, something else happened entirely.
Miss Reyes.
He extended one enormous hand with the careful gentleness of a man offering something breakable.
I'm Nico.
Sophia shook it because she was choosing her battles. Dante said nothing. His hand settled briefly at the small of her back, impersonal, steering, and she stepped forward and away from it with a clean, deliberate motion that required no comment. She felt his gaze note the step. The room at the end of the east wing was large, spare, elegant. Cream walls, dark furniture, a window overlooking a garden extraordinary, even in the thin dark of early evening. The lock engaged behind her with a sound that left nothing to interpretation. She stood at the window and did not sit on the bed, because sitting on the bed would be conceding the night. Below, in the garden, Dante Caruso stood with his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearms, speaking to two men with the focused authority of someone for whom even a late evening conversation was work to be conducted with full attention. He looked up. Their eyes met through the glass, his finding her window with the unerring precision of a man who always knew where the variables were. And something in his expression shifted. Almost nothing. Gone before she could read it. Sophia stepped back. "Stop it," she told herself with considerable firmness. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and began mapping what she knew. Episode 3, The Fight. Sophia Reyes was not by nature a passive person. By the third morning, she had tested every window latch, confirmed the east wall motion sensor, identified that the large man called Nico took his coffee at 7:15 and was therefore away from the back corridor for exactly 5 minutes, and established that the kitchen had an unlocked exterior door to the service yard. The service yard had 2 guards she hadn't anticipated. She revised her timeline. She found the wild corner of the garden on the 5th day, roses climbing a stone wall in their own architecture, lavender that had dissolved its borders and simply spread, honeysuckle consuming an iron trellis with cheerful destructiveness.
My mother planted it.
She turned. Dante was watching her from the path, hands in his pockets, having been there longer than she'd realized.
She died when I was 20.
He said, the flat precision of someone who has learned to carry a fact at arm's length.
I told the groundskeepers to leave it alone. 16 years ago.
Sophia looked at the honeysuckle consuming the roses. He stepped closer, not toward her, toward the roses, close enough that she could have reached without trying, his attention on the garden rather than on her. In that deliberate redirection, she understood something. He knew she would feel his proximity and was offering her the decency of pretending not to know. The honeysuckle is going to kill the roses within another season, she said. Leaving it alone and preserving it are not the same thing. A silence. Then,
Fix it if you want. Or don't.
he said it quickly, like he'd been waiting for someone to tell him it was allowed. He walked back toward the house before she could answer. She started the next morning. Not for him, for the roses, which had done nothing wrong. On the 8th day, she tried her escape plan. It was not impulsive. She had spent 3 days mapping the guard rotation, identifying the 5-minute window when Nico's attention was divided between the gatehouse and the kitchen, confirming the east garden gate latch could be lifted from her side with a thin piece of wire she had removed from the botanical reference shelf without anyone noticing. By 7:15 exactly, she had her jacket on, the corridor clear, and 5 clean minutes before anyone would notice. She made it as far as the east garden gate. Nico was leaning against the stone wall on the other side of it, arms folded, coffee in hand, looking at her with the expression of a man who had been standing there for considerably longer than she'd been walking toward him.
Miss Reyes.
He said pleasantly. She looked at him, at the gate, back at him. He anticipated this too, she said flatly.
Yes.
Nico said with what might, in another context, have been admiration. He walked her back inside without drama, without touching her, simply by existing between her and every other direction. At her door, he stopped.
I'm sorry.
He said, and he meant it, which made it worse. He reached past her and she heard the lock turn from the outside for the second time since she'd arrived. She stood in the locked room and breathed through it. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the garden through the glass and thought about a man who had anticipated her second attempt too, which meant he knew her well enough to be 3 moves ahead of her before she'd even begun, which meant he had been paying a quality of attention that she was not yet ready to think about. He unlocked the door himself the following afternoon, knocked once and left without coming in. She heard his footsteps down the corridor, even and unhurried, and then nothing. She opened the door. The corridor was empty. On the floor outside was the botanical reference book she'd taken the wire from. Replaced, no note, no explanation. She picked it up and went back inside and did not go looking for him because there was nothing to say that wouldn't cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. The Cold War that followed had its own architecture. She made her animosity visible in the only ways available to her. Salt in the wrong dishes, plants left scattered across surfaces where they had no business being, books returned to entirely the wrong shelves, the careful disorder of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be kept somewhere against her will, the somewhere was going to know about it. Small, deliberate frictions. Nothing dramatic enough to be called defiance, everything pointed enough to be understood. He understood. She could tell by the way he said nothing about any of it. They barely spoke. When they did, it was brief, functional, the minimum exchange required to share a house without actively declaring one. She answered his questions about the commission in the fewest words that were still accurate. He gave her what she needed for the work and nothing else. The distance between them at dinner was polite and precise and charged in a way that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt. It was not comfortable. It was also considerably more dangerous than fighting, because fighting required distance, and this required proximity, and proximity was accumulating in ways she had stopped allowing herself to count. On the 29th day, she sabotaged a dinner. Dante had a meeting with a man called Ferretti, a real estate developer whose alliance he'd been carefully cultivating, as she'd gathered from a conversation through the study wall that she had absolutely not been listening to. The dinner centerpiece she'd arranged was spectacular. Dark foliage, white blooms, architectural and inevitable. Exactly what a man like Dante needed to communicate to a man like Ferretti. 2 hours before dinner, she replaced it. The new arrangement was beautiful. It was also wrong, wild where it should have been controlled, restless where it should have been inevitable. It said interesting when Dante needed to say certain. She went to her room and waited. He came at 9:15, with the particular controlled stillness of a man managing something he has decided not to perform.
Ferretti spent 40 minutes talking about the flowers.
He said from the doorway.
He found them provocative. The proposal didn't close.
Terrible, Sophia said from the armchair where she'd been reading. You should find a better florist. He stepped into the room and came to stand before the armchair, not close enough to threaten, but close enough that she would need to stand to be at eye level. She did not stand.
You told me once,
He said quietly and without particular emphasis,
that being dangerous and attractive was inefficient. That most men managed one or the other.
His eyes held hers.
You said it was factually a problem.
The room became extremely still. She had no memory of saying it. She knew with complete cold certainty that she had said it. The champagne, the car, the part of the evening she had filed firmly under inadmissible. But she had no memory of the words, only the vague and humiliating shape of the feeling. He had kept it. For weeks he had kept it, said nothing, and was using it now. In the middle of a fight about flowers, in the tone of a man establishing something he has decided she should know. That was... She started.
I know what it was.
He said.
I'm telling you, I remember it. All of it.
A pause.
Every word.
She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would restore the ground she had just lost. He crouched then, bringing himself to eye level, removing the height advantage he clearly knew he had, and the expression on his face was honest in a way she hadn't prepared for.
Sophia,
His voice dropped to something quiet that was considerably more effective than volume.
if you do that again, I will ensure your gallery show closes, and every venue in New York understands you're unavailable for the foreseeable future. Your career is too important to you for that to be an empty threat.
The words landed exactly where he intended. She set down the book and looked at him with the full force of her fury, undisguised for the first time. You would do that?
If you give me reason to.
No apology, no cruelty, just fact. Then you should know, she said quietly, that I will spend every moment looking for a way out. Being trapped is something I cannot manage without fighting it. So we can threaten each other's important things until one of us runs out of ammunition, or you can let me go home. She held his gaze. Those are your options. He stood, stepped back. The distance between them restored itself, and he looked at her for a moment in the way of a man who has heard something that has complicated things for him.
Good night, Sophia,
he said, and pulled the door closed. She sat in the armchair for a long time. She was angry at him. She was angrier at herself, because the fury she'd shown had required the intimacy of knowing someone well enough to mean it, and she was not ready for what that implied. Episode 4, Milan. He asked her to Milan on a Tuesday.
a hotel property in Brera. The botanical consultant left and we're 3 weeks behind. I need someone who understands how organic elements interact with built space.
He was in the garden doorway, watching her work on the roses.
You understand that.
As your prisoner or as your consultant?
As my consultant,
His jaw was slightly tight.
with security.
One condition: adjacent rooms, not connected. Something crossed his face. Brief, controlled, unmistakable.
Agreed.
He turned back toward the house. Sophia returned to the roses and told herself firmly that the warmth climbing the back of her neck was simply the afternoon sun. Milan recalibrated everything. Without the estate around them, without the locked doors and the weight of the arrangement pressing on every exchange, they were different proportions to each other. She worked on the hotel, and Dante worked alongside her with a spatial intelligence that matched hers, asking questions that were about actually understanding rather than appearing to. She found herself answering him with her real thoughts rather than her managed ones. On the second evening, they ate at a 14-seat restaurant with no menu. The conversation slipped out of professional register gradually, the way a tide goes out. He told her about his mother's garden, the summer he was 9, the wild roses she'd said he was choosing wrong and planted anyway, because choosing something and tending it was better than choosing nothing. Those are the ones I've been saving from the honeysuckle, Sophia said quietly.
I know.
The gray eyes were different in candlelight, the warmth of something contained for a long time and beginning, incrementally, to show. She was going to tell him about the key. She had been building toward it for half an hour without knowing it. She opened her mouth. His phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it, a fractional contraction crossing his expression, a man who wants to be somewhere else and cannot be.
Excuse me.
He stepped away. By the time he came back, the moment had closed. She had decided, not yet, not because she distrusted him, which she did, but because she was beginning to distrust her reasons for trusting him, which was more complicated. On the third night, she found him in the small sitting room of their shared floor, not in his room, just there, in the wrong amount of lamplight for anyone who preferred not to feel things.
Sit down, Sophia.
Something in his voice. She sat.
Your brother contacted you
He said.
before I found you. He told you something.
Not a question. The blood in her veins became approximately 10 degrees colder.
Your behavior in the car that night. Frightened, but not surprised. There's a difference. I know what surprise looks like.
He held her gaze.
What did he tell you?
Sophia looked at Dante Caruso in the lamplight of a Milan hotel and made a decision. She reached into her jacket and produced the key. It sat on her palm between them, small, flat, ordinary looking. I don't know which bank, she said. Only that it was important, that I should keep it safe. He looked at the key for a long time, then at her.
Why are you telling me this now?
Because sitting on a secret in front of someone who has been more honest with me than I expected has become uncomfortable. She held his gaze. And because I think, whatever Matteo did, you deserve the truth, even if you're going to use it. He reached out and took the key. His fingers brushed her palm briefly, and he did not appear to notice, and she was not going to mention it.
Sophia.
His voice dropped to something unguarded.
Thank you.
She stood before the moment could deepen into something she wasn't ready for. She made it as far as the door. For what it's worth, she said without turning around, I don't think my brother is entirely the person you believe he is, but I think he made choices that were wrong, and I'm sorry for the consequences. The silence behind her was warm in a way silences rarely are. She went to bed and lay awake for a considerable time, furious with herself about it. Episode 5. The Betrayal. They returned from Milan on a Thursday. By Saturday, Sophia had begun to believe, with the fragile optimism of a person who has been wrong about something important and is not yet aware of it, that things were different. He had brought her coffee Friday morning. He had asked what she thought of the Brera ceiling design and actually listened. He had called the gallery and extended the show without being asked. On Saturday afternoon, she went looking for a reference book, found the study door ajar, and heard her own name. She should have kept walking. She stopped anyway.
Reyes is still unaware we photographed the key on arrival.
A man's voice. Clipped, professional. Security.
The locksmith identification came through. It's a First Republic branch box, Lower Manhattan.
I'm aware of the account.
Dante's voice. The voice he used when he had already arrived somewhere and was waiting for others to catch up.
Don't move on it until I authorize.
And the woman?
Continue the current arrangement. She's more useful here than elsewhere. The brother will move when he knows she's in our vicinity. When he does, we'll know.
Sophia stood in the corridor and felt the architecture of the last 6 weeks rearrange itself. They had photographed the key when she arrived. He had known for 6 weeks. He had let her believe she was holding a secret. The coffee, the books, the gallery extension, the dinner in Milan, the candlelight, the story about his mother's roses. All of it was management of an asset. She was bait, not a person, a lure. She walked directly into the study. Dante looked up from the desk. One look at her face told him what she knew. She watched the confirmation cross his expression. Barely, but she had become very good at reading him. You've known for 6 weeks that I have the key.
Yes.
The confirmation was worse than denial would have been. And I'm here because you knew Matteo was monitoring me. You wanted him to know I was in your hands so that when he moved toward me, you could find him.
Yes?
Still even, meeting her gaze. The dinners, Milan, the gallery extension, the books that appeared in the library. She watched his face. You were keeping your asset comfortable and accessible.
Sophia.
Don't. The word came out simply definitive. Tell me which part wasn't strategy, exactly which part, and I'll decide how much it weighs. He was quiet for too long. That's what I thought, she said. She walked out. She sat on the edge of the bed in her room and did not cry, a decision rather than a feeling, and stared at the garden until it was fully dark. She had known, at some level, from the beginning. She had chosen, with specific deliberate foolishness, to believe the version she preferred. And underneath the fury, in the place she was absolutely refusing to examine tonight, was a grief she didn't have the right to feel for something that had never existed. Episode 6. The Sending Away. On the 3rd day after Milan, Dante appeared in the garden at the time he knew she'd be there.
Victor Sorin knows about the key.
He said it without preamble.
He monitors the same financial networks Matteo was moving through. When the locksmith trace ran, it left a flag I didn't anticipate. Sorin's people have connected the box to you personally. They're looking for you, not the key. To use you the way I did, except with methods I don't use.
Sophia's hands went still on the lavender. He crouched beside her so they were at eye level. That motion again, removing the advantage, and his face wore the honest expression, not the controlled one.
There's a property in Umbria. Small, secure. Nico will go with you. Eva, if she agrees. You'll be safe there until this is resolved.
I don't need your protection. She didn't look up from the lavender. I've been managing my own safety considerably longer than you've been a problem in my life.
Soren's people are not.
I heard you the first time. She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. You're removing a variable that's become inconvenient. He said her name. She stood before he could say anything else. Tell me when the car leaves, she said, pulling her garden gloves off with deliberate calm. He was at the front of the house when she came out, not inside at the car, standing in the morning light with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with tactics.
When this is resolved,
He began. Don't, she said quietly. Please. He stopped. She got in the car. She did not look back as the gates opened because looking back was the one thing she had promised herself she would not do. She almost managed it. She lasted 4 hours in the car before she made her decision. They were 40 minutes outside the city when she told Nico she needed air. He pulled over on a quiet road flanked by pale fields, and she got out, and she walked. Not toward anything in particular, just away, because away was the only direction that made sense. She made it approximately 300 meters before the second car pulled up beside her. She had not seen the second car. Dante got out. He looked at her across the empty road in the thin afternoon light with the expression of a man who has anticipated this exact moment and finds it neither surprising nor acceptable.
get in.
He said. No.
Sophia,
His voice had dropped to the register it used when volume was no longer a tool he needed.
get in the car.
I am not going to Umbria. She kept walking. I am not going anywhere you have decided on, in a car you have chosen, to a house I haven't seen. I have done that once already. I am aware of how it ends. He fell into step beside her, which was somehow more infuriating than if he'd blocked her path.
This is not the same.
It feels remarkably similar from where I'm standing.
You are in danger.
I have been in danger since the night you put something in my drink and waited at the corner of Canal Street. She stopped and turned to face him. You do not get to use my safety as a reason to move me like furniture whenever it suits your strategy. I am not a variable. I am a person, and I am telling you, clearly and without ambiguity, that I am not getting in that car. He looked at her for a long moment. The field on either side of them was entirely indifferent to the standoff. Then he moved. She had exactly enough time to say, "Don't you dare," before he bent, put his shoulder to her waist, and lifted her off the ground with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has simply decided the conversation is finished. "Put me down." She was horizontal over his shoulder, and the indignity of it was almost worse than the fury. Almost. "Dante, put me down right now."
No.
He was already walking back toward the car. "This is..." She hit his back with her fist, which had approximately the effect of hitting a wall. "This is assault. This is kidnapping. This is..."
This is the third time you've tried to run from me,
he said with complete evenness.
and I find I have considerably less patience for it each time.
"Then you should consider letting me go."
I find I have less patience for that, too.
He got to the car, opened the door, set her down, not roughly, but with the definitive quality of a man placing something precisely where he has decided it belongs, and looked at her with the gray eyes that were infuriatingly, not even remotely apologetic. She straightened, pushed her hair back, looked at him with the full considerable force of her contempt. "I hate you," she said with great precision.
I know.
He said.
Now get in the car, Sophia.
She got in the car. He brought her back to the estate and walked her to the East Wing corridor and stopped at her door with the bearing of a man who has several things to say and has decided against all of them.
Stay here.
He held her gaze, the gray of his eyes doing something complicated that she was not going to examine tonight.
I'll be back.
Where are you going? He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, once, the way a man looks at something he intends to return to, and walked down the corridor without looking back. She stood in the doorway and watched him go, and told herself that the thing tightening in her chest was anger. It was probably anger. Episode 7, The Realization. He was gone for 4 days. Nico was there. Eva was there. The estate ran exactly as it always had. Meals at the correct times, the garden available, the East Wing unlocked. But Dante was not there, and his absence had a specific shape and weight that she refused to examine too closely. On the second day, she asked Nico where he was. Nico looked at her with the large, careful eyes of a man choosing his words.
Handling something.
He said. That's not an answer.
No.
He agreed, and returned to his coffee. On the third day, she went to the study, not to look for anything, simply because sitting in her room had become intolerable, and found a single lamp left on over the desk. A map of financial network nodes open on the surface, a name circled in ink. Soren. She stood at the desk for a long time. He had not sent her to Umbria. He had come after her on an empty road, driven her back, told her to stay, and then gone directly into the thing that made staying necessary in the first place. Alone, without telling her, without asking for anything except that she remain where he could be certain she was safe. She sat down in his chair and stayed there until the lamp went dark. On the fourth day, Matteo's call came through on Nico's number. She listened for 20 minutes. He told her everything. Soren's network, what Dante had walked into, what it had cost to dismantle it. He said it plainly, the way people speak when they have run out of versions to soften.
He ended it, Sophia.
Matteo said.
For you. That's not something men in his position do without significant personal risk.
A pause.
I think you already know that.
She sat in the kitchen garden after the call, hands still dirty, and thought about a man who had circled a name on a map and gone after it alone and said nothing to her except, "I'll be back," and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. She was still furious at him. That had not changed. But fury, she was discovering, had considerably more layers than she'd given it credit for, and underneath the one she had named was something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably close to the specific fear of caring whether a person came back. She did not want to feel that. She felt it anyway. He came back on the 5th morning, before the house had fully woken. She heard the gate from her window and stood at the glass and watched the car come up the drive in the gray early light. He got out. He was in different clothes than he'd left in. Dark, practical, the jacket she hadn't seen before. He stood for a moment in the drive with his face turned up toward the pale sky, the posture of a man completing something. Then he looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. He looked, not different exactly, but reduced by something, worn at the edges in a way she hadn't seen from him before. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance, and then he nodded. Once, small, the specific gesture of a man telling someone that he is back and it is finished and they can breathe, and went inside. She stood at the window with her hand flat against the glass and breathed. Then she took her hand off the glass, went back to the chair by the window, and sat down. She was not going to him. He knew where she was. He knocked 20 minutes later. She did not say come in. He knocked again. Once, the same way he'd knocked the day he unlocked her door and left the book on the floor. She said nothing. The door opened anyway. He stood in the doorway, still in the jacket, looking at her across the room with the careful attention of a man taking inventory of something he was afraid of finding damaged. She looked back at him from the chair. She had been rehearsing this, the precise, controlled delivery of everything she intended to say. 4 days had given her considerable material. You went alone after Soren, she said.
With two people I trust. Effectively alone.
And you left me here without telling me what you were walking into. She kept her voice level. You left me here for 4 days of not knowing whether you were coming back. He said nothing. He did not attempt to justify it. I found the map in the study. She stood because sitting felt like the wrong position for this. On the 4th day. And I sat in your chair and I looked at that name and I thought about all the things that could have happened to you. That I would have found out about from Nico in the careful voice he uses when he's deciding how much to tell me. She stopped in front of him. You went without giving me anything.
Sophia.
I'm not finished. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hit his chest with her palm. Then again. He didn't move. I had no way of knowing if you were coming back. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, more honest. And you gave me nothing. Her eyes were bright now, furious and tearful in equal measure, which she resented.
You're right.
He said, simply, without qualification. She looked up at him. He said her name. She hit his chest a 3rd time, harder, and this time his hand came up and caught her wrist. Not roughly, just stopped it, held it against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, steady and real and present. And then he kissed her, not gently, not with the careful management of a man making a strategic decision, with the complete, absolute collapse of someone who has spent 5 days in the middle of something dangerous, holding a single thought in reserve and has run entirely out of reasons to keep holding it. He walked her backward until the wall met her shoulders and kissed her the way he apparently did everything, completely, without announcement, as if he had already decided on the outcome and was simply bringing reality into alignment. She kissed him back. She was still furious. The fury did not go anywhere. It simply became something else, something that burned at the same temperature but in an entirely different direction. And she had her hands in the front of his jacket, and he had one hand at her jaw and the other against the wall beside her head. And for a long, suspended moment, there was nothing in the room except the two of them, and what had been accumulating between them since a street corner in Canal. He pulled back first, barely, just enough to look at her, his forehead almost against hers, his breathing not quite steady, those gray eyes up close and unguarded in a way she had only seen from him twice before, and both times it had undone something in her chest. She looked back at him. Then she dropped her forehead against his collarbone and put her arms around him and held on. He went very still for a moment, the stillness of a man who has not been held in a very long time and has forgotten what to do with it. And then his arms came around her, and he held her back with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been learning what it means to handle something precious without possessing it. I'm still angry.
I know.
She tightened her grip slightly. He didn't move. She felt him exhale. Slow, complete, the specific release of a man setting something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. Don't do that again, she said quietly. Don't go somewhere that could kill you and leave me with nothing. I don't care what the situation requires. You tell me. Whatever it is, you tell me.
Okay.
He said. Not I'll try. Not when I can. Just okay. The word of a man who has decided. She was quiet for a moment. I love you, she said, into his jacket. Without looking up, because looking up would make it too large and she needed it to be small and true and just between them. Which is the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me, and I want you to know I hold you entirely responsible. His arms tightened around her.
I love you too,
he said into her hair. She stayed where she was for a long moment, her face against his collarbone, his arms around her, the morning coming in pale through the window, and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Outside, the garden was very quiet. The roses, for once, were exactly where they were supposed to be. Epilogue, the following spring. The wedding was in May, which was Sophia's call. because May in the estate garden meant the roses were in full flower, and the lavender was exactly 2 weeks from blooming, and the wild corner looked like something a very romantic person had planned, which she had not, and which made it better. 60 people, not 500. The people they actually knew, in the place where the important things had already happened. Matteo stood beside his sister before she walked out. Leaner, quieter, carrying something he'd earned the hard way. She took his face in her hands and looked at him for a moment without speaking, and he understood.
"Ready?"
He said. "Don't make it sentimental."
"I'm your brother. Everything I do is sentimental."
"Fair point." She took his arm. "Let's go." Dante watched her come toward him through the garden and lost every managed, composed, carefully controlled part of himself in approximately 4 seconds. He had been running an operation for the first 36 years of his life, managing people, reading rooms, positioning himself at the center of every situation, because being somewhere without control was something he had never learned to bear. And then a woman had walked out of a gallery with her back absolutely straight, had been unmanageable from the first moment, and had refused to let him be anything other than honest, and had made a deliberate decision to trust him, and then discovered he hadn't fully earned it, and had refused to pretend otherwise. She reached him. She looked up with the brown eyes that had been, from the beginning, the most direct and difficult eyes he had ever encountered. "You look overwhelmed," she said quietly.
I am.
The corner of her mouth curved. "Keep that. It looks good on you." He took her hand. And that is the end. If this story made you feel something, if you found yourself holding your breath in that car scene, or furious in Chapter 5, or quietly devastated by the epilogue, please leave a comment below and tell me which moment got you. I want to know. If you're new here, subscribe. I post audio stories like this regularly, and I have more dark romance, slow burn, and enemies to lovers on the way. Likes genuinely help this channel reach people who would love these stories, so if you enjoyed this, a like takes 2 seconds and means the world. Thank you for listening, genuinely. The fact that you stayed until the end of this story means everything. I'll see you in the next one.